Early 19th century. Richard Owen's 1861 geological timescale from paleontology, showing the appearance of major animal types. 61. Paleontology and geology. In 1796, Georges Cuvier published his findings on the differences between living elephants and those found in the fossil record. His analysis identified mammoths and mastodons as distinct species, different from any living animal, and effectively ended a long-running debate over whether a species could become extinct. 62. In 1788, James Hutton described gradual geological processes operating continuously over deep time. 63. In the 1790s, William Smith began the process of ordering rock strata by examining fossils in the layers while he worked on his geologic map of England. Independently, in 1811, Cuvier and Alexander Brongniart published an influential study of the geologic history of the region around Paris, based on the stratigraphic succession of rock layers. These works helped establish the antiquity of the Earth. 64. Cuvier advocated catastrophism to explain the patterns of extinction and faunal succession revealed by the fossil record. Knowledge of the fossil record continued to advance rapidly during the first few decades of the 19th century. By the 1840s, the outlines of the geologic timescale were becoming clear, and in 1841 John Phillips named three major eras, based on the predominant fauna of each: the Paleozoic, dominated by marine invertebrates and fish; the Mesozoic, the age of reptiles; and the current Cenozoic age of mammals. This progressive picture of the history of life was accepted even by conservative English geologists like Adam Sedgwick and William Buckland. However, like Cuvier, they attributed the progression to repeated catastrophic episodes of extinction followed by new episodes of creation. 65. Unlike Cuvier, Buckland and some other advocates of natural theology among British geologists made efforts to explicitly link the last catastrophic episode proposed by Cuvier to the biblical flood. 66-67. From 1830 to 1833, geologist Charles Lyell published his multi-volume work Principles of Geology, which, building on Hutton's ideas, advocated an uniformitarian alternative to the catastrophic theory of geology. Lyell claimed that, rather than being the products of cataclysmic, and possibly supernatural, events, the geologic features of the Earth are better explained as the result of the same gradual geologic forces observable in the present day, but acting over immensely long periods of time. Although Lyell opposed evolutionary ideas, even questioning the consensus that the fossil record demonstrates a true progression, his concept that the Earth was shaped by forces working gradually over an extended period, and the immense age of the Earth assumed by his theories, would strongly influence future evolutionary thinkers such as Charles Darwin. 68. Transmutation of species. Lamarck's two-factor theory involves a complexifying force driving animal body plans towards higher levels, orthogenesis, creating a ladder of phyla, and an adaptive force causing animals with a Lamarck's two-factor theory involves a complexifying force driving animal body plans towards higher levels, orthogenesis, creating a ladder of phyla, and an adaptive force causing animals with a given body plan to adapt to circumstances, use and disuse, inheritance of acquired characteristics, creating a diversity of species and genera. 69. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck proposed, in his Philosophie zoologique of 1809, a theory of the transmutation of species, transformism. Lamarck did not believe that all living things shared a common ancestor but rather that simple forms of life were created continuously by spontaneous generation. He also believed that an innate life force drove species to become more complex over time, advancing up a linear ladder of complexity that was related to the great chain of being. Lamarck recognized that species adapted to their environment. He explained this by saying that the same innate force driving increasing complexity caused the organs of an animal or a plant to change based on the use or disuse of those organs, just as exercise affects muscles. He argued that these changes would be inherited by the next generation and produce slow adaptation to the environment. It was this secondary mechanism of adaptation through the inheritance of acquired characteristics that would become known as Lamarckism and would influence discussions of evolution into the 20th century. 70-71. A radical British school of comparative anatomy that included the anatomist Robert Edmond Grant was closely in touch with Lamarck's French school of transformationism. One of the French scientists who influenced Grant was the anatomist Étienne Geoffroy Saint-Hilaire, whose ideas on the unity of various animal body plans and the homology of certain anatomical structures would be widely influential and lead to intense debate with his colleague Georges Cuvier. Grant became an authority on the anatomy and reproduction of marine invertebrates. He developed Lamarck's and Erasmus Darwin's ideas of transmutation and evolutionism, and investigated homology, even proposing that plants and animals had a common evolutionary starting point. As a young student, Charles Darwin joined Grant in investigations of the life cycle of marine animals. In 1826, an anonymous paper, probably written by Robert Jameson, praised Lamarck for explaining how higher animals had evolved from the simplest worms. This was the first use of the word evolved in a modern sense. 72-73. Robert Chambers's Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, 1844, shows fishes F, reptiles R, and birds B branching from a path leading to mammals M. In 1844, the Scottish publisher Robert Chambers anonymously published an extremely controversial but widely read book entitled Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation. This book proposed an evolutionary scenario for the origins of the solar system and of life on Earth. It claimed that the fossil record showed a progressive ascent of animals, with current animals branching off a main line that leads progressively to humanity. It implied that the transmutations lead to the unfolding of a preordained plan that had been woven into the laws that governed the universe. In this sense it was less completely materialistic than the ideas of radicals like Grant, but its implication that humans were only the last step in the ascent of animal life incensed many conservative thinkers. The high profile of the public debate over vestiges, with its depiction of evolution as a progressive process, would greatly influence the perception of Darwin's theory a decade later. 74-75. Ideas about the transmutation of species were associated with the radical materialism of the Enlightenment and were attacked by more conservative thinkers. Cuvier attacked the ideas of Lamarck and Geoffroy, agreeing with Aristotle that species were immutable. Cuvier believed that the individual parts of an animal were too closely correlated with one another to allow for one part of the anatomy to change in isolation from the others, and argued that the fossil record showed patterns of catastrophic extinctions followed by repopulation, rather than gradual change over time. He also noted that drawings of animals and animal mummies from Egypt, which were thousands of years old, showed no signs of change when compared with modern animals. The strength of Cuvier's arguments and his scientific reputation helped keep transmutational ideas out of the mainstream for decades. 76. Richard Owen's 1848 diagram shows his conceptual archetype for all vertebrates. 77. In Great Britain, the philosophy of natural theology remained influential. William Paley's 1802 book Natural Theology with its famous watchmaker analogy had been written at least in part as a response to the transmutational ideas of Erasmus Darwin. 78. Geologists influenced by natural theology, such as Buckland and Sedgwick, made a regular practice of attacking the evolutionary ideas of Lamarck, Grant, and vestiges. 79. 80. Although Charles Lyell opposed scriptural geology, he also believed in the immutability of species, and in his Principles of Geology, he criticized Lamarck's theories of development. 68. Idealists such as Louis Agassiz and Richard Owen believed that each species was fixed and unchangeable because it represented an idea in the mind of the creator. They believed that relationships between species could be discerned from developmental patterns in embryology, as well as in the fossil record, but that these relationships represented an underlying pattern of divine thought, with progressive creation leading to increasing complexity and culminating in humanity. Owen developed the idea of archetypes in the divine mind that would produce a sequence of species related by anatomical homologies, such as vertebrate limbs. Owen led a public campaign that successfully marginalized Grant in the scientific community. Darwin would make good use of the homologies analyzed by Owen in his own theory, but the harsh treatment of Grant, and the controversy surrounding vestiges, showed him the need to ensure that his own ideas were scientifically sound. 73, 81, 82. Anticipations of natural selection. It is possible to look through the history of biology from the ancient Greeks onwards and discover anticipations of almost all of Charles Darwin's key ideas. As an example, Loren Eiseley has found isolated passages written by Buffon suggesting he was almost ready to piece together a theory of natural selection, but states that such anticipations should not be taken out of the full context of the writings or of cultural values of the time, which made Darwinian ideas of evolution unthinkable. 83. When Darwin was developing his theory, he investigated selective breeding and was impressed 84 by John Sebright's observation that a severe winter, or a scarcity of food, by destroying the weak and the unhealthy, has all the good effects of the most skillful selection, so that the weak and the unhealthy do not live to propagate their infirmities. 85. Darwin was influenced by Charles Lyell's ideas of environmental change causing ecological shifts, leading to what Augustin de Candolle had called a war between competing plant species, competition well described by the botanist William Herbert. Darwin was struck by Thomas Robert Malthus' phrase, struggle for existence, used of warring human tribes. 86, 87. Several writers anticipated evolutionary aspects of Darwin's theory, and in the third edition of On the Origin of Species published in 1861 Darwin named those he knew about in an introductory appendix, an historical sketch of the recent progress of opinion on the origin of species, which he expanded in later editions. 88. In 1813, William Charles Wells read before the Royal Society essays assuming that there had been evolution of humans, and recognizing the principle of natural selection. Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace were unaware of this work when they jointly published the theory in 1858, but Darwin later acknowledged that Wells had recognized the principle before them, writing that the paper, An Account of a White Female, part of whose skin resembles that of a Negro, was published in 1818, and he distinctly recognizes the principle of natural selection, and this is the first recognition which has been indicated, but he applies it only to the races of man, and to certain characters alone. 89. Patrick Matthew wrote in his book on Naval Timber and Arboriculture, 1831, of continual balancing of life to circumstance. The progeny of the same parents, under great differences of circumstance, might, in several generations, even become distinct species, incapable of co-production. 90. Darwin implies that he discovered this work after the initial publication of The Origin. In the brief historical sketch that Darwin included in the third edition he says, unfortunately the view was given by Mr. Matthew very briefly in scattered passages in an appendix to a work on a different subject. He clearly saw, however, the full force of the principle of natural selection. 91. However, as historian of science Peter J. Buller says, through a combination of bold theorizing and comprehensive evaluation, Darwin came up with a concept of evolution that was unique for the time. Buller goes on to say that simple priority alone is not enough to secure a place in the history of science. Someone has to develop an idea and convince others of its importance to have a real impact. 92. Thomas Henry Huxley said in his essay on the reception of On the Origin of Species, The suggestion that new species may result from the selective action of external conditions upon the variations from their specific type which individuals present, and which we call spontaneous, because we are ignorant of their causation, is as wholly unknown to the historian of scientific ideas as it was to biological specialists before 1858. But that suggestion is the central idea of the origin of species, and contains the quintessence of Darwinism. 93. Natural selection. Charles Darwin's first sketch of an evolutionary tree from his B. Notebook on the Transmutation of Species 1837-1838. The biogeographical patterns Charles Darwin observed in places such as the Galapagos Islands during the second voyage of HMS Beagle caused him to doubt the fixity of species, and in 1837 Darwin started the first of a series of secret notebooks on transmutation. Darwin's observations led him to view transmutation as a process of divergence and branching, rather than the ladder-like progression envisioned by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and others. In 1838 he read the new 6th edition of an essay on the principle of population, written in the late 18th century by Thomas Robert Malthus. Malthus' idea of population growth leading to a struggle for survival combined with Darwin's knowledge on how breeders selected traits, led to the inception of Darwin's theory of natural selection. Darwin did not publish his ideas on evolution for 20 years. However, he did share them with certain other naturalists and friends, starting with Joseph Dalton Hooker, with whom he discussed his unpublished 1844 essay on natural selection. During this period he used the time he could spare from his other scientific work to slowly refine his ideas and, aware of the intense controversy around transmutation, amass evidence to support them. In September 1854 he began full-time work on writing his book on natural selection. 82, 94, 95. Unlike Darwin, Alfred Russel Wallace, influenced by the book Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, already suspected that transmutation of species occurred when he began his career as a naturalist. By 1855, his biogeographical observations during his fieldwork in South America and the Malay Archipelago made him confident enough in a branching pattern of evolution to publish a paper stating that every species originated in close proximity to an already existing closely allied species. Like Darwin, it was Wallace's consideration of how the ideas of Malthus might apply to animal populations that led him to conclusions very similar to those reached by Darwin about the role of natural selection. In February 1858, Wallace, unaware of Darwin's unpublished ideas, composed his thoughts into an essay and mailed them to Darwin, asking for his opinion. The result was the joint publication in July of an extract from Darwin's 1844 essay along with Wallace's letter. Darwin also began work on a short abstract summarizing his theory, which he would publish in 1859 as On the Origin of Species. 96. 1859-1930s, Darwin and his legacy. Othniel Charles Marsh's diagram of the evolution of horse feet and teeth over time is reproduced in Thomas Henry Huxley's Professor Huxley in America, 1876. 97. By the 1850s, whether or not species evolved was a subject of intense debate, with prominent scientists arguing both sides of the issue. 98. The publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species fundamentally transformed the discussion over biological origins. 99. Darwin argued that his branching version of evolution explained a wealth of facts in biogeography, anatomy, embryology, and other fields of biology. He also provided the first cogent mechanism by which evolutionary change could persist, his theory of natural selection. 100. One of the first and most important naturalists to be convinced by origin of the reality of evolution was the British anatomist Thomas Henry Huxley. Huxley recognized that unlike the earlier transmutational ideas of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck and Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, Darwin's theory provided a mechanism for evolution without supernatural involvement, even if Huxley himself was not completely convinced that natural selection was the key evolutionary mechanism. Huxley would make advocacy of evolution a cornerstone of the program of the X Club to reform and professionalize science by displacing natural theology with naturalism and to end the domination of British natural science by the clergy. By the early 1870s in English-speaking countries, thanks partly to these efforts, evolution had become the mainstream scientific explanation for the origin of species. 100. In his campaign for public and scientific acceptance of Darwin's theory, Huxley made extensive use of new evidence for evolution from paleontology. This included evidence that birds had evolved from reptiles, including the discovery of Archaeopteryx in Europe, and a number of fossils of primitive birds with teeth found in North America. Another important line of evidence was the finding of fossils that helped trace the evolution of the horse from its small five-toed ancestors. 101. However, acceptance of evolution among scientists in non-English-speaking nations such as France, and the countries of Southern Europe and Latin America was slower. An exception to this was Germany, where both August Weismann and Ernst Haeckel championed this idea. Haeckel used evolution to challenge the established tradition of metaphysical idealism in German biology, much as Huxley used it to challenge natural theology in Britain. 102. Haeckel and other German scientists would take the lead in launching an ambitious program to reconstruct the evolutionary history of life based on morphology and embryology. 103. Darwin's theory succeeded in profoundly altering scientific opinion regarding the development of life and in producing a small philosophical revolution. 104. However, this theory could not explain several critical components of the evolutionary process. Specifically, Darwin was unable to explain the source of variation in traits within a species, and could not identify a mechanism that could pass traits faithfully from one generation to the next. Darwin's hypothesis of pangenesis, while relying in part on the inheritance of acquired characteristics, proved to be useful for statistical models of evolution that were developed by his cousin Francis Galton in the biometric school of evolutionary thought. However, this idea proved to be of little use to other biologists. 105. Application to humans. This illustration, The Root of the March of Progress, 106, was the frontispiece of Thomas Henry Huxley's book Evidences to Man's Place in Nature, 1863. Huxley applied Darwin's ideas to humans, using comparative anatomy to show that humans and apes had a common ancestor, which challenged the theologically important idea that humans held a unique place in the universe. 107. Charles Darwin was aware of the severe reaction in some parts of the scientific community against the suggestion made in Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation that humans had arisen from animals by a process of transmutation. Therefore, he almost completely ignored the topic of human evolution in On the Origin of Species. Despite this precaution, the issue featured prominently in the debate that followed the book's publication. For most of the first half of the 19th century, the scientific community believed that, although geology had shown that the Earth and life were very old, human beings had appeared suddenly just a few thousand years before the present. However, a series of archaeological discoveries in the 1840s and 1850s showed stone tools associated with the remains of extinct animals. By the early 1860s, as summarized in Charles Lyell's 1863 book Geological Evidences of the Antiquity of Man, it had become widely accepted that humans had existed during a prehistoric period, which stretched many thousands of years before the start of written history. This view of human history was more compatible with an evolutionary origin for humanity than was the older view. On the other hand, at that time there was no fossil evidence to demonstrate human evolution. The only human fossils found before the discovery of Java man in the 1890s were either of anatomically modern humans or of Neanderthals that were too close, especially in the critical characteristic of cranial capacity, to modern humans for them to be convincing intermediates between humans and other primates. 108. Therefore, the debate that immediately followed the publication of On the Origin of Species centered on the similarities and differences between humans and modern apes. Carolus Linnaeus had been criticized in the 18th century for grouping humans and apes together as primates in his groundbreaking classification system. 109. Richard Owen vigorously defended the classification suggested by Georges Cuvier and Johann Friedrich Blumenbach that placed humans in a separate order from any of the other mammals, which by the early 19th century had become the orthodox view. On the other hand, Thomas Henry Huxley sought to demonstrate a close anatomical relationship between humans and apes. In one famous incident, which became known as the Great Hippocampus Question, Huxley showed that Owen was mistaken in claiming that the brains of gorillas lacked a structure present in human brains. Huxley summarized his argument in his highly influential 1863 book Evidences to Man's Place in Nature. Another viewpoint was advocated by Lyell and Alfred Russel Wallace. They agreed that humans shared a common ancestor with apes, but questioned whether any purely materialistic mechanism could account for all the differences between humans and apes, especially some aspects of the human mind. 108. In 1871, Darwin published The Descent of Man, and Selection in Relation to Sex, which contained his views on human evolution. Darwin argued that the differences between the human mind and the minds of the higher animals were a matter of degree rather than of kind. For example, he viewed morality as a natural outgrowth of instincts that were beneficial to animals living in social groups. He argued that all the differences between humans and apes were explained by a combination of the selective pressures that came from our ancestors moving from the trees to the plains, and sexual selection. The debate over human origins, and over the degree of human uniqueness continued well into the 20th century. 108. Alternatives to natural selection. This photo from Henry Fairfield Osborn's 1917 book Origin and Evolution of Life shows models depicting the evolution of teeth and other horns over time, which Osborn claimed was an example of an orthogenetic trend in evolution. 110. The concept of evolution was widely accepted in scientific circles within a few years of the publication of Origin, but the acceptance of natural selection as its driving mechanism was much less widespread. The four major alternatives to natural selection in the late 19th century were theistic evolution, neo-Lamarckism, orthogenesis, and saltationism. Alternatives supported by biologists at other times included structuralism, Georges Cuvier's teleological but non-evolutionary functionalism, and vitalism. Theistic evolution was the idea that God intervened in the process of evolution, to guide it in such a way that the living world could still be considered to be designed. The term was promoted by Charles Darwin's greatest American advocate Asa Gray. However, this idea gradually fell out of favor among scientists, as they became more and more committed to the idea of methodological naturalism and came to believe that direct appeals to supernatural involvement were scientifically unproductive. By 1900, theistic evolution had largely disappeared from professional scientific discussions, although it retained a strong popular following. 111-112. In the late 19th century, the term neo-Lamarckism came to be associated with the position of naturalists who viewed the inheritance of acquired characteristics as the most important evolutionary mechanism. Advocates of this position included the British writer and Darwin critic Samuel Butler, the German biologist Ernst Haeckel, and the American paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope. They considered Lamarckism to be philosophically superior to Darwin's idea of selection acting on random variation. Cope looked for, and thought he found, patterns of linear progression in the fossil record. Inheritance of acquired characteristics was part of Haeckel's recapitulation theory of evolution, which held that the embryological development of an organism repeats its evolutionary history. 111-112 Critics of neo-Lamarckism, such as the German biologist August Weismann and Alfred Russel Wallace, pointed out that no one had ever produced solid evidence for the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Despite these criticisms, neo-Lamarckism remained the most popular alternative to natural selection at the end of the 19th century, and would remain the position of some naturalists well into the 20th century. 111-112 Orthogenesis was the hypothesis that life has an innate tendency to change, in a unilinear fashion, towards ever greater perfection. It had a significant following in the 19th century, and its proponents included the Russian biologist Leo S. Berg and the American paleontologist Henry Fairfield Osborn. Orthogenesis was popular among some paleontologists, who believed that the fossil record showed a gradual and constant unidirectional change. Saltationism was the idea that new species arise as a result of large mutations. It was seen as a much faster alternative to the Darwinian concept of a gradual process of small random variations being acted on by natural selection, and was popular with early geneticists such as Hugo de Vries, William Bateson, and early in his career, Thomas Hunt Morgan. It became the basis of the mutation theory of evolution. 111.112. Mendelian genetics, biometrics, and mutation. Diagram from Thomas Hunt Morgan's 1919 book The Physical Basis of Heredity, showing the sex-linked inheritance of the white-eyed. Mutation in Drosophila melanogaster. The rediscovery of Gregor Mendel's laws of inheritance in 1900 ignited a fierce debate between two camps of biologists. In one camp were the Mendelians, who were focused on discrete variations in the laws of inheritance. They were led by William Bateson, who coined the word genetics, and Hugo de Vries, who coined the word mutation. Their opponents were the biometricians, who were interested in the continuous variation of characteristics within populations. Their leaders, Carl Pearson and Walter Frank Raphael Weldon, followed in the tradition of Francis Galton, who had focused on measurement and statistical analysis of variation within a population. The biometricians rejected Mendelian genetics on the basis that discrete units of heredity, such as genes, could not explain the continuous range of variation seen in real populations. Weldon's work with crabs and snails provided evidence that selection pressure from the environment could shift the range of variation in wild populations, but the Mendelians maintained that the variations measured by biometricians were too insignificant to account for the evolution of new species. 113.114. When Thomas Hunt Morgan began experimenting with breeding the fruit fly Drosophila melanogaster, he was a saltationist who hoped to demonstrate that a new species could be created in the lab by mutation alone. Instead, the work at his lab between 1910 and 1915 reconfirmed Mendelian genetics and provided solid experimental evidence linking it to chromosomal inheritance. His work also demonstrated that most mutations had relatively small effects, such as a change in eye color, and that rather than creating a new species in a single step, mutations served to increase variation within the existing population. 113.114. 1920s-1940s. Biston beetleria F. typica is the white-bodied form of the peppered moth. Biston beetleria F. carbonaria is the black-bodied form of the peppered moth. Population genetics. The Mendelian and biometrician models were eventually reconciled with the development of population genetics. A key step was the work of the British biologist and statistician Ronald Fisher. In a series of papers starting in 1918 and culminating in his 1930 book The Genetical Theory of Natural Selection, Fisher showed that the continuous variation measured by the biometricians could be produced by the combined action of many discrete genes, and that natural selection could change gene frequencies in a population, resulting in evolution. In a series of papers beginning in 1924, another British geneticist, J.B.S. Haldane, applied statistical analysis to real-world examples of natural selection, such as the evolution of industrial melanism in peppered moths, and showed that natural selection worked at an even faster rate than Fisher assumed. 115.116. The American biologist Sewall Wright, who had a background in animal breeding experiments, focused on combinations of interacting genes, and the effects of inbreeding on small, relatively isolated populations that exhibited genetic drift. In 1932, Wright introduced the concept of an adaptive landscape and argued that genetic drift in inbreeding could drive a small, isolated subpopulation away from an adaptive peak, allowing natural selection to drive it towards different adaptive peaks. The work of Fisher, Haldane and Wright founded the discipline of population genetics. This integrated natural selection with Mendelian genetics, which was the critical first step in developing a unified theory of how evolution worked. 115.116. Modern synthesis. Several major ideas about evolution came together in the population genetics of the early 20th century to form the modern synthesis, including genetic variation, natural selection, and particulate Mendelian inheritance. This ended the eclipse of Darwinism and supplanted a variety of non-Darwinian theories of evolution. In the early 20th century, most field naturalists continued to believe that alternative mechanisms of evolution such as Lamarckism and orthogenesis provided the best explanation for the complexity they observed in the living world. But as the field of genetics continued to develop, those views became less tenable. 117. Theodosius Dobzhansky, a postdoctoral worker in Thomas Hunt Morgan's lab, had been influenced by the work on genetic diversity by Russian geneticists such as Sergei Chetverikov. He helped to bridge the divide between the foundations of microevolution developed by the population geneticists and the patterns of macroevolution observed by field biologists, with his 1937 book Genetics and the Origin of Species. Dobzhansky examined the genetic diversity of wild populations and showed that, contrary to the assumptions of the population geneticists, these populations had large amounts of genetic diversity, with marked differences between subpopulations. The book also took the highly mathematical work of the population geneticists and put it into a more accessible form. In Britain, E.B. Ford, the pioneer of ecological genetics, continued throughout the 1930s and 1940s to demonstrate the power of selection due to ecological factors including the ability to maintain genetic diversity through genetic polymorphisms such as human blood types. Ford's work would contribute to a shift in emphasis during the course of the modern synthesis towards natural selection over genetic drift. 115, 116, 118, 119. The evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr was influenced by the work of the German biologist Bernhard Rensch, showing the influence of local environmental factors on the geographic distribution of subspecies in closely related species. Mayr followed up on Dobzhansky's work with the 1942 book Systematics and the Origin of Species, which emphasized the importance of allopatric speciation in the formation of new species. This form of speciation occurs when the geographical isolation of a subpopulation is followed by the development of mechanisms for reproductive isolation. Mayr also formulated the biological species concept that defined a species as a group of interbreeding or potentially interbreeding populations that were reproductively isolated from all other populations. 115, 116, 120. In the 1944 book Tempo and Mode in Evolution, George Gaylord Simpson showed that the fossil record was consistent with the irregular non-directional pattern predicted by the developing evolutionary synthesis, and that the linear trends that earlier paleontologists had claimed supported orthogenesis and neo-Lamarckism did not hold up to closer examination. In 1950, G. Ledyard Stebbins published Variation and Evolution in Plants, which helped to integrate botany into the synthesis. The emerging cross-disciplinary consensus on the workings of evolution would be known as the modern synthesis. It received its name from the 1942 book Evolution, The Modern Synthesis by Julian Huxley. 115, 116. The modern synthesis provided a conceptual core, in particular, natural selection and Mendelian population genetics, that tied together many, but not all, biological disciplines. Developmental biology was one of the omissions. It helped establish the legitimacy of evolutionary biology, a primarily historical science, in a scientific climate that favored experimental methods over historical ones. 121. The synthesis also resulted in a considerable narrowing of the range of mainstream evolutionary thought, what Stephen Jay Gould called the hardening of the synthesis. By the 1950s, natural selection acting on genetic variation was virtually the only acceptable mechanism of evolutionary change. Panselectionism and macroevolution was simply considered the result of extensive microevolution. 122, 123. 1940s-1960s, molecular biology and evolution. The middle decades of the 20th century saw the rise of molecular biology, and with it an understanding of the chemical nature of genes as sequences of DNA and of their relationship, through the genetic code, to protein sequences. Increasingly powerful techniques for analyzing proteins, such as protein electrophoresis and sequencing, brought biochemical phenomena into the realm of the synthetic theory of evolution. In the early 1960s, biochemists Linus Pauling and Emil Zuckerkandl proposed the molecular clock hypothesis, MCH, that sequence differences between homologous proteins could be used to calculate the time since two species diverged. By 1969, Moto Kimura and others provided a theoretical basis for the molecular clock, arguing that, at the molecular level at least, most genetic mutations are neither harmful nor helpful and that mutation and genetic drift, rather than natural selection, cause a large portion of genetic change, the neutral theory of molecular evolution. 124. Studies of protein differences within species also brought molecular data to bear on population genetics by providing estimates of the level of heterozygosity in natural populations. 125. From the early 1960s, molecular biology was increasingly seen as a threat to the traditional core of evolutionary biology. Established evolutionary biologists, particularly Ernst Mayr, Theodosius Dobzhansky, and George Gaylord Simpson, three of the architects of the modern synthesis, were extremely skeptical of molecular approaches, especially their connection, or lack thereof, to natural selection. The molecular clock hypothesis and the neutral theory were particularly controversial, spawning the neutralist-selectionist debate over the relative importance of mutation, drift and selection, which continued into the 1980s without a clear resolution. 126, 127. Late 20th century. Gene-centered view. In the mid-1960s, George C. Williams strongly critiqued explanations of adaptations worded in terms of survival of the species, group selection arguments. Such explanations were largely replaced by a gene-centered view of evolution, epitomized by the kin selection arguments of W. D. Hamilton, George R. Price and John Maynard Smith. 128. This viewpoint would be summarized and popularized in the influential 1976 book The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins. 129. Models of the period CMED to show that group selection was severely limited in its strength, though newer models DO admit the possibility of significant multi-level selection. 130. In 1973, Lee Van Valen proposed the term, Red Queen, which he took from Through the Looking Glass by Lewis Carroll, to describe a scenario where a species involved in evolutionary arms races would have to constantly change to keep pace with the species with which it was co-evolving. Hamilton, Williams and others suggested that this idea might explain the evolution of sexual reproduction. The increased genetic diversity caused by sexual reproduction would help maintain resistance against rapidly evolving parasites, thus making sexual reproduction common, despite the tremendous cost from the gene-centric point of view of a system where only half of an organism's genome is passed on during reproduction. 131, 132. Contrary to the expectations of the Red Queen hypothesis, Hanley et al. Found that the prevalence, abundance and mean intensity of mites was significantly higher in sexual geckos than in asexuals sharing the same habitat. 133. Furthermore, Parker, after reviewing numerous genetic studies on plant disease resistance, failed to find a single example consistent with the concept that pathogens are the primary selective agent responsible for sexual reproduction in their host. 134. At an even more fundamental level, Heng 135 and Gorelick and Heng 136 reviewed evidence that sex, rather than enhancing diversity, acts as a constraint on genetic diversity. They consider that sex acts as a coarse filter, weeding out major genetic changes, such as chromosomal rearrangements, but permitting minor variation, such as changes at the nucleotide or gene level, that are often neutral to pass through the sexual sieve. The adaptive function of sex remains a major unresolved issue. The competing models to explain the adaptive function of sex were reviewed by Birdsall and Wills. 137. A principal alternative view to the Red Queen hypothesis is that sex arose, and is maintained, as a process for repairing DNA damage, and that genetic variation is produced as a byproduct. 138. 139. The gene-centric view has also led to an increased interest in Charles Darwin's idea of sexual selection, 140, and more recently in topics such as sexual conflict and intragenomic conflict. Sociobiology. W. D. Hamilton's work on kin selection contributed to the emergence of the discipline of sociobiology. The existence of altruistic behaviors has been a difficult problem for evolutionary theorists from the beginning. 141. Significant progress was made in 1964 when Hamilton formulated the inequality in kin selection known as Hamilton's rule, which showed how eusociality in insects, the existence of sterile worker classes, and other examples of altruistic behavior could have evolved through kin selection. Other theories followed, some derived from game theory, such as reciprocal altruism. 142. In 1975, E.O. Wilson published the influential and highly controversial book Sociobiology, the new synthesis which claimed evolutionary theory could help explain many aspects of animal, including human, behavior. Critics of sociobiology, including Stephen Jay Gould and Richard Lewontin, claimed that sociobiology greatly overstated the degree to which complex human behaviors could be determined by genetic factors. They also claimed that the theories of sociobiologists often reflected their own ideological biases. Despite these criticisms, work has continued in sociobiology and the related discipline of evolutionary psychology, including work on other aspects of the altruism problem. 143. 144. Evolutionary paths and processes. A phylogenetic tree showing the three-domain system. Eukaryotes are colored red, archaea green, and bacteria blue. One of the most prominent debates arising during the 1970s was over the theory of punctuated equilibrium. Niles Eldredge and Stephen Jay Gould proposed that there was a pattern of fossil species that remained largely unchanged for long periods, what they termed stasis, interspersed with relatively brief periods of rapid change during speciation. 145. 146. Improvements in sequencing methods resulted in a large increase of sequenced genomes, allowing the testing and refining of evolutionary theories using this huge amount of genome data. 147. Comparisons between these genomes provide insights into the molecular mechanisms of speciation and adaptation. 148. 149. These genomic analyses have produced fundamental changes in the understanding of evolutionary history, such as the proposal of the three-domain system by Carl Woese. 150. Advances in computational hardware and software allow the testing and extrapolation of increasingly advanced evolutionary models and the development of the field of systems biology. 151. One of the results has been an exchange of ideas between theories of biological evolution and the field of computer science known as evolutionary computation, which attempts to mimic biological evolution for the purpose of developing new computer algorithms. Discoveries in biotechnology now allow the modification of entire genomes, advancing evolutionary studies to the level where future experiments may involve the creation of entirely synthetic organisms. 152. Microbiology, horizontal gene transfer, and endosymbiosis. Microbiology was largely ignored by early evolutionary theory due to the paucity of morphological traits and the lack of a species concept in microbiology, particularly amongst prokaryotes. Microbiology was largely ignored by early evolutionary theory due to the paucity of morphological traits and the lack of a species concept in microbiology, particularly amongst prokaryotes. 153. Now, evolutionary researchers are taking advantage of their improved understanding of microbial physiology and ecology, produced by the comparative ease of microbial genomics, to explore the taxonomy and evolution of these organisms. 154. These studies are revealing unanticipated levels of diversity amongst microbes. 155. 156. One important development in the study of microbial evolution came with the discovery in Japan in 1959 of horizontal gene transfer. 157. This transfer of genetic material between different species of bacteria came to the attention of scientists because it played a major role in the spread of antibiotic resistance. 158. More recently, as knowledge of genomes has continued to expand, it has been suggested that lateral transfer of genetic material has played an important role in the evolution of all organisms. 159. These high levels of horizontal gene transfer have led to suggestions that the family tree of today's organisms, the so-called tree of life, is more similar to an interconnected web. 160. 161. The endosymbiotic theory for the origin of organelles sees a form of horizontal gene transfer as a critical step in the evolution of eukaryotes. 162. 163. The endosymbiotic theory holds that organelles within the cells of eukaryotes such as mitochondria and chloroplasts had descended from independent bacteria that came to live symbiotically within other cells. It had been suggested in the late 19th century when similarities between mitochondria and bacteria were noted, but largely dismissed until it was revived and championed by Lynn Margulis in the 1960s and 1970s. Margulis was able to make use of new evidence that such organelles had their own DNA that was inherited independently from that in the cell's nucleus. 164. From spandrels to evolutionary developmental biology. In the 1980s and 1990s, the tenets of the modern evolutionary synthesis came under increasing scrutiny. There was a renewal of structuralist themes in evolutionary biology in the work of biologists such as Brian Goodwin and Stuart Kauffman, 165, which incorporated ideas from cybernetics and systems theory, and emphasized the self-organizing processes of development as factors directing the course of evolution. The evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould revived earlier ideas of heterochrony, alterations in the relative rates of developmental processes over the course of evolution, to account for the generation of novel forms, and, with the evolutionary biologist Richard Lewontin, wrote an influential paper in 1979 suggesting that a change in one biological structure, or even a structural novelty, could arise incidentally as an accidental result of selection on another structure, rather than through direct selection for that particular adaptation. They called such incidental structural changes spandrels, after an architectural feature. 166 later, Gould and Elizabeth Verba discussed the acquisition of new functions by novel structures arising in this fashion, calling them exaptations. 167. Molecular data regarding the mechanisms underlying development accumulated rapidly during the 1980s and 1990s. It became clear that the diversity of animal morphology was not the result of different sets of proteins regulating the development of different animals, but from changes in the deployment of a small set of proteins common to all animals. 168. These proteins became known as a developmental genetic toolkit. 169. Such perspectives influenced the disciplines of phylogenetics, paleontology and comparative developmental biology, and spawned the new discipline of evolutionary developmental biology, Evo-Devo. 170. 21st century. Macroevolution and microevolution. One of the tenets of population genetics is that macroevolution, the evolution of phylogenetic clades at the species level and above, was solely the result of the mechanisms of microevolution, changes in gene frequency within populations, operating over an extended period of time. During the last decades of the 20th century, some paleontologists raised questions about whether other factors, such as punctuated equilibrium and group selection operating on the level of entire species and even higher level phylogenetic clades, needed to be considered to explain patterns in evolution revealed by statistical analysis of the fossil record. Some researchers in evolutionary developmental biology suggested that interactions between the environment and the developmental process might have been the source of some of the structural innovations seen in macroevolution, but other Evo-Devo researchers maintained that genetic mechanisms visible at the population level are fully sufficient to explain all macroevolution. 171, 172, 173. Epigenetic inheritance. Epigenetics is the study of heritable changes in gene expression or cellular phenotype caused by mechanisms other than changes in the underlying DNA sequence. By the first decade of the 21st century, it was accepted that epigenetic mechanisms were a necessary part of the evolutionary origin of cellular differentiation. 174. Although epigenetics in multicellular organisms is generally thought to be involved in differentiation, with epigenetic patterns, reset, when organisms reproduce, there have been some observations of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance. This shows that in some cases non-genetic changes to an organism can be inherited. Such inheritance may help with adaptation to local conditions and affect evolution. 175. Some have suggested that in certain cases a form of Lamarckian evolution may occur. 176. Axes. The idea of an extended evolutionary synthesis extends the 20th century modern synthesis to include concepts and mechanisms such as multi-level selection theory, transgenerational epigenetic inheritance, niche construction and evolvability, though several different such syntheses have been proposed, with no agreement on what exactly would be included. 177, 178, 179, 180. Unconventional evolutionary theory. Omega point. Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's metaphysical omega point theory, found in his book The Phenomenon of Man 1955, 181, describes the gradual development of the universe from subatomic particles to human society, which he viewed as its final stage and goal, a form of orthogenesis. 182. Gaia hypothesis. The Gaia hypothesis proposed by James Lovelock holds that the living and non-living parts of Earth can be viewed as a complex interacting system with similarities to a single organism. 183, 184. The Gaia hypothesis has also been viewed by Lynn Margulis, 185, and others as an extension of endosymbiosis and exosymbiosis. 186. This modified hypothesis postulates that all living things have a regulatory effect on the Earth's environment that promotes life overall. Self-organization. The mathematical biologist Stuart Kauffman suggested that self-organization may play roles alongside natural selection in 3 areas of evolutionary biology: population dynamics, molecular evolution, and morphogenesis. 165. However, Kauffman does not take into account the essential role of energy in driving biochemical reactions in cells, as proposed by Christian de Duve and modeled mathematically by Richard Bagley and Walter Fontana. Their systems are self-catalyzing but not simply self-organizing, as they are thermodynamically open systems relying on a continuous input of energy. 187. See also: Lamarckism. Lamarckism, also known as Lamarckian inheritance or Neo-Lamarckism, 2, is the notion that an organism can pass on to its offspring physical characteristics that the parent organism acquired through use or disuse during its lifetime. It is also called the inheritance of acquired characteristics, or more recently soft inheritance. The idea is named after the French zoologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, 1744-1829, who incorporated the classical era theory of soft inheritance into his theory of evolution as a supplement to his concept of orthogenesis, a drive towards complexity. Lamarck argued, as part of his theory of heredity, that a blacksmith's sons inherit the strong muscles he acquires from his work. 1. Introductory textbooks contrast Lamarckism with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. However, Darwin's book On the Origin of Species gave credence to the idea of heritable effects of use and disuse, as Lamarck had done, and his own concept of pangenesis similarly implied soft inheritance. 2. 3. Many researchers from the 1860s onwards attempted to find evidence for Lamarckian inheritance, but these have all been explained away. 4. 5. Either by other mechanisms such as genetic contamination or as fraud. August Weismann's experiment, considered definitive in its time, is now considered to have failed to disprove Lamarckism, as it did not address use and disuse. Later, Mendelian genetics supplanted the notion of inheritance of acquired traits, eventually leading to the development of the modern synthesis, and the general abandonment of Lamarckism in biology. Despite this, interest in Lamarckism has continued. In the 21st century, experimental results in the fields of epigenetics, genetics, and somatic hypermutation demonstrated the possibility of transgenerational epigenetic inheritance of traits acquired by the previous generation. These proved a limited validity of Lamarckism. 6. The inheritance of the hologenome, consisting of the genomes of all an organism's symbiotic microbes as well as its own genome, is also somewhat Lamarckian in effect, though entirely Darwinian in its mechanisms. 7. Early history. Origins. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck repeated the ancient folk wisdom of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. The inheritance of acquired characteristics was proposed in ancient times and remained a current idea for many centuries. The historian of science Conway Zirkel wrote in 1935 that, 8. Lamarck was neither the first nor the most distinguished biologist to believe in the inheritance of acquired characters. He merely endorsed a belief which had been generally accepted for at least 2,200 years before his time and used it to explain how evolution could have taken place. The inheritance of acquired characters had been accepted previously by Hippocrates, Aristotle, Galen, Roger Bacon, Jerome Cardan, Levinus Lemnius, John Ray, Michael Adanson, Joe Fried, Blumenbach and Erasmus Darwin among others. 8. Zirkel noted that Hippocrates described pangenesis, the theory that what is inherited derives from the whole body of the parent, whereas Aristotle thought it impossible, but that all the same, Aristotle implicitly agreed to the inheritance of acquired characteristics, giving the example of the inheritance of a scar, or of blindness, though noting that children do not always resemble their parents. Zirkel recorded that Pliny the Elder thought much the same. Zirkel pointed out that stories involving the idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics appear numerous times in ancient mythology and the Bible and persisted through to Rudyard Kipling's Just the Stories. 9. The idea is mentioned in 18th century sources such as Diderot's de Lembert's Dream. 10. Erasmus Darwin's Zoonomia, circa 1795, suggested that warm-blooded animals develop from one living filament, with the power of acquiring new parts, in response to stimuli, with each round of improvements being inherited by successive generations. 11. Darwin's pangenesis. Charles Darwin's pangenesis theory. Every part of the body emits tiny gemmules which migrate to the gonads and contribute to the next generation via the fertilized egg. Changes to the body during an organism's life would be inherited, as in Lamarckism. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species proposed natural selection as the main mechanism for development of species, but like Lamarck gave credence to the idea of heritable effects of use and disuse as a supplementary mechanism. 12. Darwin subsequently set out his concept of pangenesis in the final chapter of his book The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication, 1868, which gave numerous examples to demonstrate what he thought was the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Pangenesis, which he emphasized was a hypothesis, was based on the idea that somatic cells would, in response to environmental stimulation, use and disuse, throw off gemmules or pangenes which traveled around the body, though not necessarily in the bloodstream. These pangenes were microscopic particles that supposedly contained information about the characteristics of their parent cell, and Darwin believed that they eventually accumulated in the germ cells where they could pass on to the next generation the newly acquired characteristics of the parents. 13. 14. Darwin's half-cousin, Francis Galton, carried out experiments on rabbits, with Darwin's cooperation, in which he transfused the blood of one variety of rabbit into another variety in the expectation that its offspring would show some characteristics of the first. They did not, and Galton declared that he had disproved Darwin's hypothesis of pangenesis, but Darwin objected, in a letter to the scientific journal Nature, that he had done nothing of the sort, since he had never mentioned blood in his writings. He pointed out that he regarded pangenesis as occurring in protozoa and plants, which have no blood, as well as in animals. 15. Lamarck's evolutionary framework. Lamarck's two-factor theory involves 1. A complexifying force that drives animal body plans towards higher levels, orthogenesis, creating a ladder of phyla, and 2. An adaptive force that causes animals with a given body plan to adapt to circumstances, use and disuse, inheritance of acquired characteristics, creating a diversity of species and genera. Lamarckism is the name now widely used for the adaptive force. Between 1800 and 1830, Lamarck proposed a systematic theoretical framework for understanding evolution. He saw evolution as comprising 4 laws, 16, 17. 1. Life by its own force tends to increase the volume of all organs which possess the force of life, and the force of life extends the dimensions of those parts up to an extent that those parts bring to themselves. 2. The production of a new organ in an animal body results from a new requirement arising, and which continues to make itself felt, and a new movement which that requirement gives birth to, and its upkeep maintenance. 3. The development of the organs, and their ability, are constantly a result of the use of those organs. 4. All that has been acquired, traced, or changed, in the physiology of individuals, during their life, is conserved through the genesis, reproduction, and transmitted to new individuals who are related to those who have undergone those changes. Lamarck's discussion of heredity. In 1830, in an aside from his evolutionary framework, Lamarck briefly mentioned two traditional ideas in his discussion of heredity, in his day considered to be generally true. Between 1800 and 1830, Lamarck proposed a systematic theoretical framework for understanding evolution. He saw evolution as comprising four laws, 17. 1. Life by its own force tends to increase the volume of all organs which possess the force of life, and the force of life extends the dimensions of those parts up to an extent that those parts bring to themselves. 2. The production of a new organ in an animal body results from a new requirement arising, and which continues to make itself felt, and a new movement which that requirement gives birth to, and its upkeep maintenance. 3. The development of the organs, and their ability, are constantly a result of the use of those organs. 4. All that has been acquired, traced, or changed, in the physiology of individuals, during their life, is conserved through the genesis, reproduction, and transmitted to new individuals who are related to those who have undergone those changes. Lamarck's discussion of heredity. In 1830, in an aside from his evolutionary framework, Lamarck briefly mentioned two traditional ideas in his discussion of heredity, in his day considered to be generally true. The first was the idea of use versus disuse. He theorized that individuals lose characteristics they do not require, or use, and develop characteristics that are useful. The second was to argue that the acquired traits were heritable. He gave as an imagined illustration the idea that when giraffes stretch their necks to reach leaves high in trees, they would strengthen and gradually lengthen their necks. These giraffes would then have offspring with slightly longer necks. In the same way, he argued, a blacksmith, through his work, strengthens the muscles in his arms, and thus his sons would have similar muscular development when they mature. Lamarck stated the following two laws. 1. Premier Lloyd. English translation. 1. First law, use and disuse. In every animal which has not passed the limit of its development, a more frequent and continuous use of any organ gradually strengthens, develops and enlarges that organ, and gives it a power proportional to the length of time it has been so used, while the permanent disuse of any organ imperceptibly weakens and deteriorates it, and progressively diminishes its functional capacity, until it finally disappears. 1. First law, use and disuse. In every animal which has not passed the limit of its development, a more frequent and continuous use of any organ gradually strengthens, develops and enlarges that organ, and gives it a power proportional to the length of time it has been so used, while the permanent disuse of any organ imperceptibly weakens and deteriorates it, and progressively diminishes its functional capacity, until it finally disappears. 2. Second law, soft inheritance. All the acquisitions are losses wrought by nature on individuals, through the influence of the environment in which their race has long been placed, and hence through the influence of the predominant use or permanent disuse of any organ. All these are preserved by reproduction to the new individuals which arise, provided that the acquired modifications are common to both sexes, or at least to the individuals which produce the young. 18. In essence, a change in the environment brings about change in needs, besoins, resulting in change in behavior, causing change in organ usage and development, bringing change in form over time, and thus the gradual transmutation of the species. As the evolutionary biologists and historians of science Conway Zirkel, Michael Gisselen, and Stephen Jay Gould have pointed out, these ideas were not original to Lamarck. 8.2.19. Weismann's experiment. August Weismann's germplasm theory. The hereditary material, the germplasm, is confined to the gonads and the gametes. Somatic cells of the body develop afresh in each generation from the germplasm, creating an invisible, Weismann barrier, to Lamarckian influence from the soma to the next generation. August Weismann's germplasm theory held that germline cells in the gonads contain information that passes from one generation to the next, unaffected by experience, and independent of the somatic body cells. This implied what came to be known as the Weismann barrier, as it would make Lamarckian inheritance from changes to the body difficult or impossible. 20. Weismann conducted the experiment of removing the tails of 68 white mice, and those of their offspring over 5 generations, and reporting that no mice were born in consequence without a tail or even with a shorter tail. In 1889, he stated that 901 young were produced by 5 generations of artificially mutilated parents, and yet there was not a single example of a rudimentary tail or of any other abnormality in this organ. 21. The experiment, and the theory behind it, were thought at the time to be a refutation of Lamarckism. 20. The experiment's effectiveness in refuting Lamarck's hypothesis is doubtful, as it did not address the use and disuse of characteristics in response to the environment. The biologist Peter Gaudier noted in 1990 that, 22. Can Weismann's experiment be considered a case of disuse? Lamarck proposed that when an organ was not used, it slowly, and very gradually atrophied. In time, over the course of many generations, it would gradually disappear as it was inherited in its modified form in each successive generation. Cutting the tails off mice does not seem to meet the qualifications of disuse, but rather falls in a category of accidental misuse. Lamarck's hypothesis has never been proven experimentally, and there is no known mechanism to support the idea that somatic change, however acquired, can in some way induce a change in the germplasm. On the other hand, it is difficult to disprove Lamarck's idea experimentally, and it seems that Weissman's experiment fails to provide the evidence to deny the Lamarckian hypothesis, since it lacks a key factor, namely the willful exertion of the animal in overcoming environmental obstacles. 22. Ghiselin also considered the Weissman tail chopping experiment to have no bearing on the Lamarckian hypothesis, writing in 1994 that, 2. The acquired characteristics that figured in Lamarck's thinking were changes that resulted from an individual's own drives and actions, not from the actions of external agents. Lamarck was not concerned with wounds, injuries or mutilations, and nothing that Lamarck had set forth was tested or disproven by the Weissman tail chopping experiment. 2. The historian of science Rasmus Winther stated that Weissman had nuanced views about the role of the environment on the germplasm. Indeed, like Darwin, he consistently insisted that a variable environment was necessary to cause variation in the hereditary material. 23. Textbook Lamarckism. The long neck of the giraffe is often used as an example in popular explanations of Lamarckism. However, this was only a small part of his theory of evolution towards perfection. It was a hypothetical illustration, and he used it to discuss his theory of heredity, not evolution. 2. The identification of Lamarckism with the inheritance of acquired characteristics is regarded by evolutionary biologists including Ghiselin as a falsified artifact of the subsequent history of evolutionary thought, repeated in textbooks without analysis, and wrongly contrasted with a falsified picture of Darwin's thinking. Ghiselin notes that Darwin accepted the inheritance of acquired characteristics, just as Lamarck did, and Darwin even thought that there was some experimental evidence to support it. 2. Gould wrote that in the late 19th century, evolutionists, reread Lamarck, cast aside the guts of it, and elevated one aspect of the mechanics, inheritance of acquired characters, to a central focus it never had for Lamarck himself. 24. He argued that the restriction of Lamarckism to this relatively small and non-distinctive corner of Lamarck's thought must be labeled as more than a misnomer, and truly a discredit to the memory of a man and his much more comprehensive system. 3. 25. Neo-Lamarckism. Context. Edward Drinker Cope. The period of the history of evolutionary thought between Darwin's death in the 1880s and the foundation of population genetics in the 1920s and the beginnings of the modern evolutionary synthesis in the 1930s is called the eclipse of Darwinism by some historians of science. During the time, many scientists and philosophers accepted the reality of evolution but doubted whether natural selection was the main evolutionary mechanism. 26. Among the most popular alternatives were theories involving the inheritance of characteristics acquired during an organism's lifetime. Scientists who felt that such Lamarckian mechanisms were the key to evolution were called Neo-Lamarckians. They included the British botanist George Henslow (1835–1925), who studied the effects of environmental stress on the growth of plants, in the belief that such environmentally induced variation might explain much of plant evolution, and the American entomologist Alpheus Spring Packard Jr., who studied blind animals living in caves and wrote a book in 1901 about Lamarck and his work. 27–28 also included were paleontologists like Edward Drinker Cope and Alpheus Hyatt, who observed that the fossil record showed orderly, almost linear, patterns of development that they felt were better explained by Lamarckian mechanisms than by natural selection. Some people, including Cope and the Darwin critic Samuel Butler, felt that inheritance of acquired characteristics would let organisms shape their own evolution, since organisms that acquired new habits would change the use patterns of their organs, which would kickstart Lamarckian evolution. They considered this philosophically superior to Darwin's mechanism of random variation acted on by selective pressures. Lamarckism also appealed to those, like the philosopher Herbert Spencer and the German anatomist Ernst Haeckel, who saw evolution as an inherently progressive process. 27. The German zoologist Theodor Eimer combined Lamarckism with ideas about orthogenesis, the idea that evolution is directed towards a goal. 29. With the development of the modern synthesis of the theory of evolution, and a lack of evidence for a mechanism for acquiring and passing on new characteristics, or even their heritability, Lamarckism largely fell from favor. Unlike Neo-Darwinism, Neo-Lamarckism is a loose grouping of largely heterodox theories and mechanisms that emerged after Lamarck's time, rather than a coherent body of theoretical work. 30. 19th century. Charles Edward Brown Secord tried to demonstrate Lamarckism by mutilating guinea pigs. Neo-Lamarckian versions of evolution were widespread in the late 19th century. The idea that living things could to some degree choose the characteristics that would be inherited allowed them to be in charge of their own destiny as opposed to the Darwinian view, which placed them at the mercy of the environment. Such ideas were more popular than natural selection in the late 19th century as it made it possible for biological evolution to fit into a framework of a divine or naturally willed plan, thus the Neo-Lamarckian view of evolution was often advocated by proponents of orthogenesis. 31. According to the historian of science Peter J. Bowler, writing in 2003. One of the most emotionally compelling arguments used by the Neo-Lamarckians of the late 19th century was the claim that Darwinism was a mechanistic theory which reduced living things to puppets driven by heredity. The selection theory made life into a game of Russian roulette, where life or death was predetermined by the genes one inherited. The individual could do nothing to mitigate bad heredity. Lamarckism, in contrast, allowed the individual to choose a new habit when faced with an environmental challenge and shape the whole future course of evolution. 32. Scientists from the 1860s onwards conducted numerous experiments that purported to show Lamarckian inheritance. Some examples are described in the table. Early 20th century. Paul Kammerer claimed in the 1920s to have found evidence for Lamarckian inheritance in midwife toads, in a case celebrated by the journalist Arthur Koestler, but the results are thought to be either fraudulent or at best misinterpreted. A century after Lamarck, scientists and philosophers continued to seek mechanisms and evidence for the inheritance of acquired characteristics. Experiments were sometimes reported as successful, but from the beginning these were either criticized on scientific grounds or shown to be fakes. 50, 51, 52, 4, 5, for instance, in 1906, the philosopher Eugenio Rignano argued for a version that he called centroepigenesis, 53, 54, 55, 56, 57, 58, but it was rejected by most scientists. 59, some of the experimental approaches are described in the table. Early 20th century experiments attempting to demonstrate Lamarckian inheritance. Scientist date experiment claimed result rebuttal. William Lawrence Tower. 1907-2. Late 20th century. The British anthropologist Frederick Wood Jones and the South African paleontologist Robert Broom supported a neo-Lamarckian view of human evolution. The German anthropologist Hermann Kloch relied on a neo-Lamarckian model of evolution to try and explain the origin of bipedalism. Neo-Lamarckism remained influential in biology until the 1940s when the role of natural selection was reasserted in evolution as part of the modern evolutionary synthesis. 91. Herbert Graham Cannon, a British zoologist, defended Lamarckism in his 1959 book Lamarck and Modern Genetics. 92. In the 1960s, biochemical Lamarckism was advocated by the embryologist Paul Wintrebert. 93. Neo-Lamarckism was dominant in French biology for more than a century. French scientists who supported Neo-Lamarckism included Edmond Perrier (1844–1921), Alfred Giard (1846–1908), Gaston Bonnier (1853–1922), and Pierre-Paul Grasset (1895–1985). They followed two traditions, one mechanistic, one vitalistic after Henri Bergson's philosophy of evolution. 94. In 1987, Ryuichi Matsuda coined the term pan-environmentalism for his evolutionary theory, which he saw as a fusion of Darwinism with Neo-Lamarckism. He held that heterochrony is a main mechanism for evolutionary change and that novelty in evolution can be generated by genetic assimilation. 95-96. His views were criticized by Arthur M. Shapiro for providing no solid evidence for his theory. Shapiro noted that Matsuda himself accepts too much at face value and is prone to wish-fulfilling interpretation. 96. Ideological Neo-Lamarckism. Trofim Lysenko promoted an ideological form of Neo-Lamarckism which adversely influenced Soviet agricultural policy in the 1930s. A form of Lamarckism was revived in the Soviet Union of the 1930s when Trofim Lysenko promoted the ideologically driven research program, Lysenkoism. This suited the ideological opposition of Joseph Stalin to genetics. Lysenkoism influenced Soviet agricultural policy, which in turn was later blamed for the numerous massive crop failures experienced within Soviet states. 97. Critique. George Gaylord Simpson in his book Tempo and Mode in Evolution, 1944, claimed that experiments in heredity have failed to corroborate any Lamarckian process. 98. Simpson noted that Neo-Lamarckism stresses a factor that Lamarck rejected, inheritance of direct effects of the environment, and Neo-Lamarckism is closer to Darwin's pangenesis than Lamarck's views. 99. Simpson wrote, the inheritance of acquired characters failed to meet the tests of observation and has been almost universally discarded by biologists. 100. Zirkel pointed out that Lamarck did not originate the hypothesis that acquired characteristics could be inherited, so it is incorrect to refer to it as Lamarckism. What Lamarck really did was to accept the hypothesis that acquired characters were heritable, a notion which had been held almost universally for well over 2,000 years and which his contemporaries accepted as a matter of course, and to assume that the results of such inheritance were cumulative from generation to generation, thus producing, in time, new species. His individual contribution to biological theory consisted in his application to the problem of the origin of species of the view that acquired characters were inherited and in showing that evolution could be inferred logically from the accepted biological hypotheses. He would doubtless have been greatly astonished to learn that a belief in the inheritance of acquired characters is now labeled Lamarckian, although he would almost certainly have felt flattered if evolution itself had been so designated. 9. Peter Medawar wrote regarding Lamarckism, very few professional biologists believe that anything of the kind occurs, or can occur, but the notion persists for a variety of non-scientific reasons. Medawar stated there is no known mechanism by which an adaptation acquired in an individual's lifetime can be imprinted on the genome, and Lamarckian inheritance is not valid unless it excludes the possibility of natural selection, but this has not been demonstrated in any experiment. 101. Martin Gardner wrote in his book Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science, 1957. A host of experiments have been designed to test Lamarckianism. All that have been verified have proved negative. On the other hand, tens of thousands of experiments, reported in the journals and carefully checked and rechecked by geneticists throughout the world, have established the correctness of the gene mutation theory beyond all reasonable doubt. In spite of the rapidly increasing evidence for natural selection, Lamarck has never ceased to have loyal followers. There is indeed a strong emotional appeal in the thought that every little effort an animal puts forth is somehow transmitted to his progeny. 102. According to Ernst Mayr, any Lamarckian theory involving the inheritance of acquired characters has been refuted as DNA does not directly participate in the making of the phenotype and that the phenotype, in turn, does not control the composition of the DNA. 103. Peter J. Bowler has written that although many early scientists took Lamarckism seriously, it was discredited by genetics in the early 20th century. 104. Mechanisms resembling Lamarckism. Studies in the field of epigenetics, genetics and somatic hypermutation, 105, 106, have highlighted the possible inheritance of traits acquired by the previous generation. 107, 108, 109, 110, 111. However, the characterization of these findings as Lamarckism